For more than a decade, education policymakers and parents alike have been asking an important question. How does our state measure up to other states when it comes to determining what it means to be proficient on our state assessments? How does our state compare to the National Assessment of Educational Progress? The National Center for Education Statistics set out to answer these questions for all 50 states and the District of Columbia in the 2013 NAEP Mapping Report. In order for states to measure whether they are making progress, each state administers its own assessment and sets its own standard. The percentage of students that reach proficiency is determined not only by student performance, but also where the state sets its standard for proficiency. Policymakers and, of course, educators and parents want to be able to compare states' progress and the state's performance standards. But because they're all different, a common yardstick is necessary to make comparisons. This study uses NAEP as that common yardstick. In doing so, we are able to determine the rigor of state standards for proficiency. The National Assessment of Educational Progress, known as NAEP, assesses a sample of students from across the country and administers the same assessment under the same conditions. This results in progress being measured the same way in all 50 states and the district. In the constantly evolving education policy environment, this study shows us where every state stands against the same benchmarks of performance. To better understand why this study was conducted, we're going to look at Grade 8 reading results from two states, Arizona and Kentucky. We're using 2011 data. First, we see in 2011, 71% of students in each state scored at or above the proficiency standard set by their state for Grade 8 reading. On NAEP, however, 28% of students in Arizona scored at or above the proficient achievement level set by the National Assessment Governing Board, while 36% did so in Kentucky. It's clear that the NAEP standard for proficient is different from either state standard. If we just use the state standards, it would appear that students' performance in the two states was similar. However, using NAEP as the common yardstick, it's clear that there's a higher percentage of high-performing students in Kentucky than in Arizona. This demonstrates how mapping state proficiency standards onto NAEP puts the state results in context. Now we're going to see how we map state proficiency standards onto the NAEP scale. Again, we see that in 2011, 71% of students in Arizona scored at or above the state proficiency cut point for Grade 8 reading. Then we ask where the cut point would be for the top 71% of students on NAEP in Arizona. Our analysis determined that 71% of students in Arizona scored at or above 243 on Grade 8 reading. And so we find that 243 is Arizona's NAEP equivalence score of the state cut point for proficient. In 2011, for Grade 8 reading in Kentucky, we again see that 71% of students scored at or above the state proficiency cut point. On NAEP, 71% of students in Kentucky scored at or above 252, giving us the NAEP equivalence score for Kentucky. As you can see, 243 for Arizona is lower than the 252 for Kentucky. In other words, for 8th grade reading in 2011, Arizona's state proficiency cut point is different from Kentucky's. This NAEP equivalence score is our basis for making comparisons from state to state. Before we share the results, let's briefly mention some background on the mapping study, as well as explain how to read the figures in the report and in the presentation. We've released 4 earlier reports, this being the 5th, using NAEP state data for reading and mathematics at grades 4 and 8, starting in 2003. This report examines state proficiency standards for reading and math grades 4 and 8 for the 2012-2013 school year. It also analyzes 2011 and 2009 NAEP and state assessment data. It does not reflect changes the states may have made to their proficiency standards after 2013. The NAEP equivalence score, shown by the blue circle, represents where the state standard for proficiency lies on the NAEP scale. The black bars indicate the margin of error surrounding the estimate of a NAEP equivalence score. Because NAEP does not assess every student in every state, rather a relatively small representative sample of students, there is always a margin of error. As a result, even if two states have different equivalence scores, if the bars overlap, we can't say that the difference between the two scores is statistically significant. Now we'll look at the results of our study for 2013. Let's start with 4th grade reading. Here you see the NAEP equivalence scores for grade 4 reading for all 50 states and the District of Columbia. As explained a few moments ago, the figure also shows the error bands associated with each state's NAEP equivalence score. On the left of the chart, you see the NAEP reading scale, ranging vertically from 0 to 500. To get an idea of the range between the top and the bottom standards, let's look at those states on the extreme ends, Georgia and New York. We see New York's standards map 76 points higher on the NAEP scale than Georgia's. 26 states had proficiency standards that were below the NAEP basic cut point. 23 standards are within the basic range, and 2 are in the NAEP proficient range. In grade 4 math, the range in proficiency standards was 49 points. 4 states had proficiency standards that were below basic, and the majority, 42, were in the basic range. 5 states were in the proficient range. This map shows where the state's NAEP equivalence score for grade 4 math mapped within the NAEP achievement levels, below basic, in the basic range, or in the proficient range. And here we see the same thing for 4th grade reading. This table shows how state standards mapped on both the NAEP math and reading assessments. If you look at the upper right, you'll see that Wisconsin and New York were the only states that had their 4th grade math and reading standards at the proficient level. You'll also notice, looking at the far left column, that in grade 4 reading, 26 states mapped below the NAEP basic level. For math, if you look at the center row, you see that 42 states mapped in the basic level. Now for grade 8. Let's start with reading. Here we see the largest range between NAEP equivalency scores, an 83-point disparity between Georgia and New York. 10 state standards were below the basic cut point. 40 were in the basic range. Only 1 state, New York, was in the proficient range. For grade 8 math, the range between state standards was 60 points. 8 states had proficiency standards that were below NAEP basic. 3 states, North Carolina, Texas, and New York, had a standard that was in the proficient range. We don't have results for California and Virginia for grade 8 math because the states didn't administer a state test in general math to all students. Again, we see a map so we can get a national picture. You see that the majority of state standards were within the NAEP basic range for reading, and the same being true for math. Still, 5 states had proficiency standards that were below basic for both reading and math. In the upper right cell, we see New York was the only state to have both their math and reading standards mapped to proficient in 8th grade. If you'll recall, New York also had their 4th grade standards map into the proficient range, making New York the only state to have their 4th and 8th grade math and reading standards map at the NAEP proficient level. Finally, you see the majority of states in both reading, the center column, and math, the center row, had state standards that mapped into the basic category. To better understand how the standards landscape has developed in the past several years, we'll now look at how the range between state proficiency standards has changed between 2009 and 2013. First, we'll look at the range between NAEP equivalence scores for state reading standards in grade 4. the variation among state standards in Grade 4 reading widened from 63 points in 2009 to 76 points in 2013. In Grade 4 math, the pattern was reversed. The variation among state standards narrowed by 10 points. Now we'll see how the number of states' proficiency standards within the context of NAEP achievement levels has changed. In Grade 4 reading, 2 state proficiency standards were mapped at the NAEP proficient level, but before 2013 there were no states mapping at the proficient level. More state standards have moved within the NAEP basic range, and fewer states are falling below basic. In Grade 4 math, the number of states whose standards were at the NAEP proficient level increased, but most state standards are still within the NAEP basic range. In Grade 8 reading, the variation across state standards has widened over time. In Grade 8 math, the pattern was reversed. The variation among state standards in 2013 is 11 points narrower than that of 2009. Compared to other years, in 2013, more state standards mapped at the basic level. In Grade 8 math, 3 state proficiency standards were at the NAEP proficient level. So what can policymakers and parents take away from this study? There's a wide variation between states' proficiency standards, ranging from 49 to 83 points on the NAEP scale, depending on the subject and grade. In Grade 4, the majority of state reading proficiency standards were below the NAEP basic level, whereas in math, the majority of state standards were in the NAEP basic level. In Grade 8, most of the state reading and math standards were in the NAEP basic level. Overall, the variation in state proficiency standards is wider in reading than in math. As we touched on earlier, New York had all 4 proficiency standards mapped to the NAEP proficient level. Massachusetts, North Carolina, Texas, and Wisconsin were the only states to have at least 2 standards that mapped to the NAEP proficient range. Overall, very few states map at or above NAEP's proficient level. It's clear, however, that state standards in general are closer to NAEP's proficient level in math than in reading. Finally, there were 3 states, Alabama, Georgia, and Idaho, whose state proficiency standards fell below NAEP's basic range. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook for the latest updates on new reports and studies.